The first time I saw the human flinch, I decided the rumors about their species had been exaggerated for sport. I am Jairk Van Osai, first blade of the Ilvaran sword courts, 17-time champion of the Kesthail reflex trials, the fastest hand ever recorded among my bloodline in 4 generations of formal dueling records. Among my people, the Ilvaran speed is not merely a skill, it is scripture. We are a species built by evolution, and then refined by 10,000 years of deliberate culture around a single, unforgiving truth, that in the moment a blade leaves its arc, there is no thought fast enough to outplan it, only reflex fast enough to outmove it. We do not train our duelists to think during a bout. We train them to stop thinking entirely, to let the body's raw electrochemical speed take over in the narrow window where conscious deliberation is already too slow to matter. My nervous system conducts signal nearly 40% faster than the galactic median. My eyes process visual information at a refresh rate that lets me watch a blade's rotation, the way slower species watch a leaf drift to the ground. I have spent my entire life being, quite simply, faster than everyone I have ever stood across a dueling floor from, and I had never once, before that season, had cause to imagine what it might feel like to be wrong about that. So when the Coalition's Cultural Exchange Program sent a delegation of human observers to the Ilvaran sword courts for the opening rounds of the Kesthail season, and I watched the small human contingent seated in the observer gallery flinch, audibly, at the crack of a training blade breaking sound barrier during a warm-up bout, I permitted myself the small, satisfied contempt of a species that has never had to doubt its own excellence. They startle at the noise, I said to my second, Ashen Kalravi, loudly enough that I did not particularly care whether the translation implants carried it to the gallery. Not the strike itself, mind you, merely the sound the strike makes passing through air. I have read the Coalition's physiological briefings on the human species. Their reaction time to visual stimulus averages nearly 250 milliseconds. A trained Ilvaran duelist's reaction time is closer to 80. That is not a small gap, Ashen. That is the difference between a species that can fight on this floor and a species that exists on this floor only long enough to be reminded why they should not have tried. I want to be honest about the shape of that contempt, because I have had a long time since to sit with it and understand exactly what it was built from. It was not hatred. I did not, in that moment, feel anything so charged as hatred toward the humans, because hatred requires believing something poses a genuine threat, and I did not believe that, not for one instant, watching them flinch in that gallery. What I felt was something quieter and, in its own way, more corrosive. The settled, comfortable superiority of a species that has spent 10,000 years building an entire culture around a single measurable advantage, and has therefore stopped asking whether that advantage is the only kind of advantage worth having. The delegation's liaison, a broad-shouldered human woman with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that moved across the dueling floor with a scanning, cataloging patience I did not yet know how to properly read, introduced herself to the sword court's officiating council later that same day. Her name was Captain Myril Akafer, and she held some manner of joint coalition military diplomatic rank that I did not, at the time, think worth memorizing in detail, because I had already decided, watching her cross the floor with the unhurried, ordinary gait of an unremarkable body, that nothing about her warranted the effort of close attention. Coalition intelligence has recommended human observers attend the full Kesthail season, she told the council, her translated voice carrying none of the deference I had, by reflex, expected from a species I considered several tiers beneath my own in the only measure that had ever mattered to me. We're interested in cross-species combat doctrine, particularly reflex-based systems. I understand Ilvaran dueling is considered the gold standard for reaction speed combat in this sector. It is the only standard, I said, before the council's senior magistrate could offer the more diplomatic version of the same fact, and I said it with the particular careless bluntness I had spent 17 championship seasons earning the right to use without consequence. I would caution the coalition against sending observers who intend to do more than observe, Captain. Your species' reaction speed metrics are a matter of public record. I do not say this to insult you. I say it because I have found, across many seasons of hosting well-meaning delegations, that the kindest thing I can do for a visiting species is tell them, plainly, before their pride commits them to a floor they cannot survive, exactly what that floor requires. She looked at me for a moment, not with the flustered offense I half expected, nor with the deferential retreat I had, if I am honest, been counting on to confirm my own assumptions, but with something closer to simple, unbothered assessment, the look of someone filing away a data point rather than absorbing an insult. "I appreciate the honesty," she said. "For what it's worth, I'm not here to duel First Blade. I'm here to watch and learn. But I'll admit I'm curious what 'cannot survive' means, exactly, given that my delegation includes a combat instructor with a fairly unusual service record. I'd be interested in your read on her if the opportunity ever comes up." I did not think much in that moment of the woman she gestured toward, a smaller human, seated near the back of the observer gallery, dark-haired, unremarkable in bearing, who had not so much as looked toward the dueling floor during the entire exchange, apparently occupied instead with some kind of handheld data terminal. I decided, within the span of that single glance, that whatever unusual service record the captain referred to was almost certainly a matter of administrative distinction rather than genuine combat capability, the kind of honorific title militaries award to competent logistics officers and diplomatic aides who have never actually needed to move a blade in anger. I did not bother to learn her name that day. I would learn it soon enough, and I would spend a great deal of the season that followed regretting how long it took me to take it seriously. Her name was Dr. Sarah Voss, and she was not, as I had assumed, a combat instructor in any conventional sense at all. She was, I would later learn, something considerably stranger and more difficult for my pride to categorize, a former coalition frontier operative turned reflex physiology researcher, who had spent nearly a decade of her career studying, and personally training within, the precise narrow gap between conscious perception and unconscious motor response that my entire species had built an ancient culture around monopolizing. I did not learn any of this on the first day, or the second, or even the first several weeks of that observation season. What I learned, instead, across those early weeks, was a slow accumulation of small, irritating discrepancies between what I had assumed about her and what I began, despite myself, to notice. She did not flinch at the training bouts, the way the rest of the delegation occasionally still did during particularly violent exchanges. She did not gawk at the speed the way the newer observers gawked, wide-eyed at bouts that moved too quickly for untrained eyes to track cleanly. She watched with a particular stillness that I initially mistook, the way I had mistaken so much else about her species by then, for simple incomprehension, the blank, unprocessing stare of someone whose visual system was too slow to actually register what was happening in front of it. I understand now, with the particular clarity that only comes from having been humiliated out of an assumption, that what I was actually watching was not incomprehension at all. It was calibration. She was not failing to track the bouts. She was learning to track them, deliberately, methodically, the way a scientist studies a system she intends, eventually, to master rather than merely observe. The incident that began, without either of us knowing it yet, to unmake everything I believed about the shape of speed occurred in the fourth week of the observation season, during what should have been an unremarkable exhibition bout between two of my junior court members. Ilvaran dueling exhibitions are conducted with training blades, edged but blunted, calibrated to leave a stinging mark rather than a mortal wound, the better to allow young duelists to practice full-speed engagement without the stakes of a live blade. It is, by the standards of my culture, a controlled and thoroughly safe environment, and it was in exactly that controlled, thoroughly safe environment that a training blade, deflected off an angle its wielder had not fully accounted for, went spinning free of the dueling floor's boundary markers and directly toward the observer gallery, tumbling end over end at a velocity that even my own considerable reflexes registered in the instant before it happened, as arriving too fast for any of the seated observers to meaningfully react to. I was not close enough to intervene. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters to the shape of what follows. I was standing at the officiating council's dais, nearly 15 meters from the gallery, and even my own legendary reaction speed, the fastest recorded in 4 generations of my bloodline, would not have closed that distance in time to do anything except watch. I remember, in the single frozen instant before the blade reached the gallery's front row, calculating with cold, detached horror that someone was about to be badly injured, and that there was nothing at all I could do about it. Dr. Voss caught it. I do not mean she flinched away from it, or raised an arm to deflect it, or did any of the things a merely competent reflexive response might have produced. I mean she reached out, with a single unhurried motion that somehow arrived precisely on time despite looking, to every eye in that gallery, like it had begun far too late to matter, and closed her hand around the spinning blade's hilt in midair, stopping its rotation dead between 2 fingers with a precision that suggested she had not merely reacted to the blade's trajectory, but had, in the span of a fraction of a second, actually calculated it. The gallery went silent. I remember that silence with a clarity that has not faded at all in the time since. The particular quality of stillness that falls across a room full of people who have just watched something their own understanding of physics did not prepare them to witness. I crossed the floor toward her before I had fully decided to, moving with a speed that drew its own murmur from the gathered court, and found her sitting exactly as she had been a moment before, the training blade held loosely now in one hand, her expression carrying nothing more dramatic than a kind of mild, professional interest, as though she had just successfully completed a minor laboratory procedure, rather than caught a weapon out of the air with reflexes that, by every metric my species had ever measured, her body should not have possessed. That is not possible, I said, and I am aware, recounting it now, of how foolish the sentence sounds, given that I had just watched it happen with my own considerably faster than average eyes. Your species' baseline reaction time to visual stimulus is a matter of extensively documented record. What you have just done exceeds that baseline by a margin that should not exist. She looked up at me, and there was something almost apologetic in her expression, though I would come to learn, across the following weeks, that the apology was not for having embarrassed me, which had clearly not occurred to her as a relevant concern, but for something else entirely, a kind of quiet, private awareness of how strange the explanation was about to sound, even to her. It's not really reaction time, First Blade, she said. Reaction time is what happens when you have to perceive something and then decide what to do about it. That's the 250 millisecond number you're thinking of, and yeah, that number's real for most humans most of the time. What I do isn't reacting, it's prediction. I've spent about 9 years training a very specific kind of pattern recognition, watching the shoulder, the wrist angle, the release point, the way a blade's rotation looks in the first 10 degrees of its arc, until my brain stopped needing to see where the blade currently is and started just knowing where it's going to be. By the time that blade was actually airborne, I wasn't reacting to it anymore. I already knew where my hand needed to be. I just had to let it get there. I did not, in that moment, fully understand what she was describing. I want to be honest about that, because I think the story is more honest if I do not pretend the revelation arrived all at once, in a single clean moment of humbled understanding. What I understood in that moment was only that something I had believed to be a fixed, immutable law of biology, that Ilvaran reflex speed represented an essentially unmatchable ceiling, a gap no other species could meaningfully close through mere effort, had just been directly, physically contradicted in front of an entire gallery of witnesses, by a human researcher who did not even seem to consider what she had done particularly remarkable. I did the thing my pride required of me in that moment, which was to challenge her. "I would like to test this claim of yours properly," I said, "on the dueling floor, under formal conditions, rather than as an incidental catch of a wayward training blade. If your species has genuinely developed some manner of technique that rivals Ilvaran reflex speed, I would see it demonstrated where it can be measured honestly." I want to be clear that this was not, in my own mind at the time, an unreasonable request. I told myself, and told Ashen afterward, and told the officiating council when they raised concerns about the propriety of a first blade challenging a visiting civilian researcher, that this was simply due diligence, that a single lucky catch was insufficient evidence to draw any meaningful conclusion, that a properly controlled demonstration was the only honest way to settle what had actually just happened. What it actually was, underneath the justification, was the oldest and least flattering impulse a proud species carries. I could not let the moment stand unchallenged. I needed either to see it disproven or to understand on my own terms exactly how it had been done. She agreed, with the same unbothered, matter-of-fact calm she brought to everything, and the formal exhibition was scheduled for 3 days later, under the full ceremonial conditions of a sanctioned Ilvaran duel live blade calibration reduced to training intensity, but full-speed engagement, adjudicated by the Sword Court's senior magistrates, and though neither of us said this part aloud, witnessed by every member of the observation delegation and the entire resident Ilvaran court. Because word of what had happened in that gallery had, by then, already spread through the Sword Court's halls with the particular speed that only genuinely startling gossip achieves. I trained in those 3 days with an intensity I had not brought to a bout in several seasons, not out of any serious doubt that I would win, because doubt of that kind had genuinely not yet found real purchase in me, but out of the particular defensive thoroughness of a champion who has just had the ground beneath his confidence shift, however slightly, and wants very badly to feel it settle again before he has to stand on it in front of witnesses. The exhibition, when it came, unfolded in a way that I have spent a great deal of time since trying to properly describe, because I do not think ordinary language captures it well. Ilvaran dueling exchanges at the championship level occur in a register of speed that most species cannot visually track at all, blades moving too fast for untrained eyes to follow anything but the general shape of the engagement, decided in exchanges that last, from first movement to decisive touch, somewhere between 1 and 3 seconds. Our exchange lasted the better part of 4 minutes, which is, by the standards of my sport, an almost unheard-of duration, and for every one of those 4 minutes, Dr. Voss met my strikes not with speed that matched my own raw reflex advantage, but with something I did not yet have adequate language to describe as anything other than uncanny anticipation. She was not, I want to be clear, actually faster than me in the raw physiological sense my species prizes so completely. My nervous system still conducted signal faster than hers. My eyes still processed the actual visual information of a blade's motion more quickly than hers could. But she was not relying on that register of speed at all. She was reading me, watching some minute cluster of pre-movement tells in my shoulder and wrist and weight distribution that I did not even know I was producing, and positioning her guard, again and again, in exactly the place my strike was about to arrive, before the strike itself had fully committed to its path. I struck faster than her every single exchange, and every single exchange she was already there. The bout ended, as Ilvaran exhibitions typically do, not in injury but in a formal touch, the moment one duelist's blade makes clean, uncontested contact against an opponent who has failed to defend it, and it ended with her training blade resting, with careful, deliberate lightness, against the side of my throat, having found an opening in my guard that I had not consciously offered and did not, even reviewing the recording afterward at a speed my own eyes could properly process. Fully understand how she had located. The Sword Court's gallery did not merely go silent this time. It erupted, not, I initially assumed with the particular defensive bitterness of freshly wounded pride, in celebration of her victory so much as in simple, disbelieving astonishment. The sound of an entire culture watching one of its most fundamental certainties come apart in real time. How? I said to her afterward, in the private preparation chamber where defeated duelists traditionally retreat to compose themselves before facing the court again, my voice carrying less of its earlier certainty than I would have liked. I am faster than you. Every instrument in this facility confirms it. My nervous system, my visual processing, every physiological measure available to coalition science, all of it says I should have won that exchange in the first half-second. Explain to me how you defeated a body that is, by every honest measure, faster than yours. She was quiet for a moment, setting the training blade down with the same careful, unhurried economy she brought to everything. And when she answered, there was no triumph in her voice at all, only something thoughtful, almost gentle, the tone of someone who understood exactly how much the question was actually asking. "You're not wrong that you're faster, First Blade," she said. "If this were a race, if the win condition were just whoever's nerve conduct's fastest, I'd lose every time and it wouldn't even be close. But a duel isn't a race. It's a prediction problem wearing a race's clothes. You're incredibly fast at responding to what's already happening. I've just spent 9 years training myself to stop needing to respond to what's happening and start recognizing what's about to happen, half a second before it does. Speed matters enormously right up until the moment you can see the future a little. Then it matters less than you'd think." I did not have an answer for that. I want to be honest about the particular quality of silence that followed, because it was not, in that moment, the beginning of some clean, immediate acceptance. It was something closer to vertigo, the specific disorientation of a species discovering that the single measurable advantage its entire 10,000-year culture had been built around was not, in fact, the unassailable ceiling it had always assumed, but merely one variable in a larger equation that other approaches could, apparently, root around entirely. I did not become her admirer that day. I found in the weeks that followed that my pride resisted the lesson with a stubbornness I am not particularly proud of now. I requested, and was granted, a second exhibition, not out of any renewed confidence that the first result had been an aberration exactly, but out of the particular desperate need a wounded champion feels to understand whether the loss can be explained away, or whether it must actually be absorbed. I lost the second exhibition as well, though by a narrower margin this time, because I had, in the intervening weeks, begun, grudgingly, resentfully, but genuinely, to study what she was doing, to watch the recordings of our first bout at speeds slow enough for my own analytical mind to properly parse, rather than merely my reflexes to register, and to begin, for the first time in my long championship career, actually thinking about combat as something other than a pure contest of raw nervous system speed. I found reasons in those weeks to be sharper with her than the losses alone warranted. I questioned her methodology in the officiating council's formal reviews, more pointedly than the questions required. I suggested, in briefings where I told myself the translation delay would keep the phrasing from landing too directly, that her technique represented a kind of compensatory trick, rather than genuine mastery. A diminishment I understood, even as I offered it, was not entirely honest, and offered anyway, because pride rarely waits for honesty's permission before it speaks. She never gave me the satisfaction of visible offense at any of it. That, more than the losses themselves, was what began to genuinely unsettle the last defenses of my old certainty, because I had spent my entire career assuming that pressure, correctly applied, eventually produced cracks in an opponent, and hers simply did not crack. She answered every pointed question in council reviews with the same patient, unhurried thoroughness she brought to everything, and I found myself, against my own considerable resistance, beginning to actually listen to the answers rather than simply waiting for my turn to speak again. The crisis that finally broke through what remained of my pride arrived, as these things so often do, without any warning at all. It occurred during the Kestrel season's championship exhibition, the traditional closing ceremony of the observation season, held in the Sword Court's grand arena before the full assembled body of the resident court and the entire coalition delegation, intended as a celebratory display of Ilvaran dueling mastery for our visiting guests, rather than any kind of genuine competitive contest. The malfunction began in the arena's overhead rigging, an aging counterweight system used to suspend the ceremonial banner array above the dueling floor, its maintenance cycle apparently overdue in a way that had escaped the Sword Court's otherwise meticulous safety inspections. The counterweight cable failed roughly 40 minutes into the ceremony, during a formal processional moment when the dueling floor was crowded with junior court members in ceremonial rather than combat-ready positioning, and the entire heavy banner array, along with its supporting rigging, began to fall directly toward a cluster of young duelists who had no reason to be watching the ceiling, and no combat-ready reflexes primed to react to a threat from that direction. I was close enough this time to attempt something. I want to be honest about what I attempted and about its limits, because I think it matters to what follows. I moved, the instant the cable's failure registered in my peripheral vision, with every ounce of speed my legendary reflexes could produce, and I reached one of the younger duelists in time to pull her clear of the falling rigging's primary impact zone. But there were 4 of them clustered in that space, and I am, however fast, only a single body, and I understood, in the terrible compressed half-second available for understanding anything at all, that I was not going to reach the other 3 in time, and that my own vaunted championship record speed, the fastest recorded in 4 generations of my bloodline, was simply not enough to solve a problem that required being 3 places at once. Dr. Voss was not the fastest person in that arena. I want to state that plainly, because it is true, and because the truth of it is what makes what happened next matter as much as it does. But she was already moving before the cable had fully failed. I understand now, reviewing the arena's recording afterward, that she had registered the counterweight's structural stress in its earliest visible signs. The same kind of minute pre-movement tells she had spent 9 years training herself to read in a dueling opponent's shoulder, applied instead to a piece of failing machinery that the rest of us, trained our whole lives to watch blades rather than rigging, had simply never learned to see coming. She reached the second duelist with nearly 2 full seconds to spare, pulling him clear with a controlled economy of motion that wasted no part of the margin she had earned through early recognition rather than raw reflex. And she reached the third with barely half a second remaining, close enough that the falling rigging's edge caught her across the shoulder as she completed the pull, a blow that would have been far worse if she had arrived even a fraction later. The fourth duelist, the youngest of the group, barely passed his novice trials. She could not reach in time through direct pursuit. I watched, from where I knelt with the first duelist I had managed to save, as she made a decision in the space of what the arena's recording later measured at under 200 milliseconds. Faster, in raw terms, than her own documented baseline reaction time, which I would later understand was not actually a contradiction at all, but simply confirmation of everything she had told me weeks earlier about the difference between reacting and predicting. She threw the training blade she had been carrying, still sheathed at her hip from an earlier ceremonial demonstration, in a single fluid motion that struck the failing rigging's lowest support strut at precisely the angle needed to deflect its fall trajectory, those final crucial degrees away from the young duelist's position. It worked. The rigging came down hard, loud, and close enough to leave the boy shaking on the floor of the arena, but it came down beside him rather than on top of him, and he walked away from that ceremony with nothing worse than a badly frightened evening and a story he would, I understand, tell for the rest of his life. I do not have adequate words, even now, for what I felt kneeling on that arena floor afterward, watching Dr. Voss check the injured shoulder of the duelist she had pulled clear with half a second to spare, her own composure entirely undisturbed by what she had just done, as though redirecting a collapsing ceremonial rig with a thrown blade at under 200 milliseconds notice, was simply an unremarkable extension of an ordinary day's work. I understood in that moment, with a clarity that arrived all at once rather than gradually, the way understanding sometimes does after weeks of slow, grudging accumulation, that everything I had spent 17 championship seasons believing about the nature of speed had been fundamentally incomplete. I did not speak to her again that evening. I want to be honest about why, because I think it is the part of this story that costs the most to admit. It was not gratitude in that first raw hour that kept me silent. It was humiliation of a depth I had not previously known myself capable of feeling. The specific humiliation of watching someone I had spent weeks quietly diminishing save 3 lives in a crisis where my own legendary speed had proven simply insufficient to the scale of the problem, while her patient, unglamorous, decade-long study of prediction rather than reaction had proven exactly adequate to it. It was Ashen, in the end, who forced the reckoning I did not yet have the courage to initiate myself. "First blade," she said, finding me alone in the empty arena the following morning, staring up at the still damaged rigging where the ceremonial banners had once hung. "The court is talking. Not about the malfunction. Everyone already understands that was simple mechanical failure, no one's fault. They are talking about you. About whether the first blade of the Ilveran sword courts is capable of acknowledging, in front of his own people, that a human researcher's approach to speed proved more complete than 10,000 years of our own tradition. In the one moment it actually mattered. I have not denied what happened," I said, though I heard, even as I said it, how thin the deflection sounded. "You have not denied it," Ashen agreed. "You have also not spoken to her since it happened, and everyone in this court has noticed the silence, first blade, and is drawing precisely the conclusion you would expect them to draw from it. I would suggest, with the respect our years together have earned me the right to offer bluntly, that you go and say whatever it is you have been avoiding saying, before your silence becomes the story this court remembers instead of her courage." I found her in the observation delegation's quarters later that morning, her shoulder bandaged from the previous evening's collision, reviewing what appeared to be footage of the incident on her data terminal with the same calm, analytical focus she brought to everything. And I found, standing in the doorway, that the speech I had spent half the night composing had entirely deserted me. "You saved 3 lives yesterday," I said finally, because it was the only place I could think to begin. "I saved one, and I am, by every measure my species has ever built its pride upon, the fastest duelist alive. You reached 2 of those 3 duelists through recognition rather than reflex, and the third through a decision made faster than your own documented reaction baseline should have permitted. And I have spent 17 championship seasons believing that raw nervous system speed was the only variable that mattered in a crisis of that kind. I was wrong. I have known I was wrong since the moment your training blade caught that first wayward strike out of the air in the gallery 4 weeks ago, and I have spent every day since trying to find a way to be wrong about it that did not require admitting how completely I had misjudged you. And I find, this morning, that I have simply run out of ways to avoid the admission." She set the data terminal aside and looked at me for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, there was none of the vindication in her voice that I had, on some buried level, half expected and perhaps even deserved. "I wasn't trying to prove anything yesterday, First Blade," she said. "I saw a kid about to get crushed and I did the math on what I could reach in time, and I threw the only thing in my hand that might change the angle enough to matter. I didn't have time to think about what it would look like, or what it would prove about human reflexes versus Ilvaran ones. I just thought, there's a chance, take it. I know, I said. That is, I think, the part that has been hardest to sit with. You did not do it to humble me, or to make a point about your species' methods against mine. You did it because it was simply the necessary thing to do, and the fact that it also happened to prove everything I had spent weeks quietly dismissing about your approach was entirely incidental to you. I have spent this entire season treating your technique as some manner of clever trick, a compensation for a physiological deficit rather than a genuine mastery in its own right, because I did not want to accept that speed. The single thing my entire culture has built its identity upon was not, in fact, the whole of what determines who survives a crisis and who does not. What it's worth, she said after a moment, and there was, for the first time since I had known her, something almost gentle in it. I noticed how you were treating it. The dismissiveness, I mean. I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't. But I've spent enough of my career around people who pride themselves on being the fastest in the room to know that most of them get there eventually, on their own terms, if you just keep doing the work well enough that eventually the evidence speaks for itself. You got there. That's what actually matters to me, First Blade, not how long it took you. I did not become, in the days that followed, someone who had entirely set aside 10,000 years of cultural conviction about the primacy of raw speed. I do not think a single crisis, however consequential, unmakes an inheritance that deep that quickly or that cleanly. But something had shifted, fundamentally and permanently, in how I understood the sport I had given my entire life to, and in how I understood, more broadly, everything I had once believed was the only shape excellence could take. The final test, the one that mattered most, more even than the falling rigging, because it asked something harder of me than physical courage ever had, came at the formal closing ceremony of the observation season, held before the full assembled sword court and the departing coalition delegation, where the court's senior magistrates had convened, at my own request, a formal review of what the arena incident and the exhibition bouts that preceded it meant for the future of Ilvaran dueling doctrine. Magistrate Thren Valosai, eldest of the presiding council and keeper of the sword court's oldest traditions, addressed the question with the particular unsentimental bluntness her long tenure had earned her the right to use. First Blade, she said, you are asking this council to formally acknowledge that a human researcher's approach to combat, one built on prediction and pattern study, rather than raw reflex speed, represents a legitimate parallel tradition to 10,000 years of Ilvaran doctrine. I would ask you, as the most decorated duelist this court has produced in 4 generations, whether you believe that acknowledgement honors what our tradition has built, or whether it undermines the very foundation this sword court was founded upon. I could feel in that chamber the exact shape of the easy answer, the answer that would have cost me nothing, that would have let me keep the comfortable remnants of my old certainty intact, the answer that said Ilvaran speed remains the truest and most complete measure of dueling mastery, and that Dr. Voss's achievements, however remarkable, represent an exception rather than a genuine alternative worth incorporating into our own training. I did not give that answer. Magistrate, I said, I am the fastest duelist this court has produced in 4 generations, and in the single moment that mattered most this season, my speed alone was insufficient to save 3 lives that a slower, more patient approach saved without difficulty. I do not believe acknowledging that undermines our tradition. I believe our tradition has spent 10,000 years mistaking one variable for the entire equation, and that the willingness to expand what we teach our young duelists, to train prediction alongside reflex pattern recognition alongside raw speed, does not dishonor what our ancestors built. It completes it. I would ask this council to consider whether our discomfort with this acknowledgement says more about the wisdom of resisting it, or about how unaccustomed We have become to seeing mastery arrive from outside our own tradition. The chamber was very quiet after that, and I understood in the silence that I had just done something the first blade who mocked a flinching gallery 4 weeks earlier would not have recognized as possible. The council's eventual ruling formally incorporated predictive pattern training into the Sword Court's junior curriculum, credited Dr. Voss as a founding contributor to the revision, and noted, in language I suspect cost the old magistrate something considerable to approve, that the season's events represented the most significant evolution in Ilvaran dueling doctrine in 3 generations. I found her afterward, in the quiet corridor outside the council chamber, preparing to depart with the rest of the returning delegation, and I found, standing in front of her, that I finally had the words I had spent the entire season failing to locate. I mocked your species' reflexes the first day I saw your delegation flinch at a training blade's noise, I told her. I want you to know that plainly, because I think acknowledgments that hide their own ugliness are not honest acknowledgments at all. I decided, within a single glance across that gallery, exactly what your kind was capable of, and I built an entire season of quiet contempt on top of that first careless glance. I was wrong about nearly everything I believed that day, and I do not think I would have discovered how wrong without watching you catch a blade out of the air with reflexes I did not yet understand, and then watching you save 3 lives with a technique I had spent weeks dismissing as a mere trick. She considered that for a moment, the same careful, unhurried consideration she brought to everything, and when she answered, there was no triumph in it, only something quiet and genuine. I clocked the mockery on day 1, first blade, she said. Wasn't hard to, but I've spent a long time around people who take pride in being the fastest reflexes in whatever room they're standing in, and most of them aren't cruel exactly. They're just working from the only data they've ever had reason to trust. I figured the work would speak for itself eventually. I didn't expect it to take a falling ceiling rig to make the point, but here we are. Nor did I admitted, though I find myself, strangely, grateful for it, in the way one is grateful for a wound that heals into something stronger than the bone that broke. For what it's worth, she said, and there was real warmth in it now, I don't hold the mockery against you. Everybody starts somewhere, working from what they think they already know. What matters is you didn't stay there. We stood together in that corridor for a while after that, neither of us saying very much more, because there was, by then, no longer very much that needed saying. I thought of that first gallery, weeks earlier, of the flinch I had watched with such lazy, satisfied contempt, and the particular careless certainty with which I had decided, before I had ever seen her catch a single blade, exactly what her species was and was not capable of. I thought of the champion I had believed myself to be that day, so confident in my own bloodline's monopoly on speed that I had never once considered the possibility that speed itself might be only half of a more complete equation. I had been wrong about almost everything I believed on that first day. I understood now, standing in a corridor outside a council chamber that had just formally rewritten 10,000 years of doctrine, that the mastery I had spent my whole life measuring in milliseconds and championship records was only ever one dialect in a much larger language, and that I had very nearly spent an entire career without learning to hear the rest of it. You know, I said finally, as the delegation's departure was called over the arena's announcement system, when I first saw your gallery flinch at a training blade, I told my second that your species existed on our dueling floor only long enough to be reminded why you should not have tried. She laughed, a short, genuine sound, tired and warm. I heard a version of that eventually. You weren't exactly subtle about it, first blade. I was wrong, I said, about nearly everything I believed that day. But I think I was most wrong about this. I believed speed was a thing I had already spent a lifetime mastering completely. I did not yet know it could still be a thing I had left to learn. She paused at the threshold of the departure gate and looked back at me, and there was something in her expression, not triumph, never triumph. That was never who she was, but something quieter and steadier. The look of someone who had waited a long season for a rival to become something else, and was simply, quietly glad that it finally had. "For what it's worth, First Blade," she said, "I'm glad you finally caught up. Took you long enough, champion." "Yes," I agreed, and found, to my own quiet astonishment, that the old title carried no sting at all coming from her, only something that felt, for the first time since I had watched her catch a blade midair in a silent gallery, very much like respect, freely given and freely returned. It did. I am glad I did not run out of season before I managed it.